Hey everybody, Tal here. We're continuing our newfound series of looking over the life and brilliant games of Mikhail Tal. We're starting with his earlier games and going through the progression of his life and games so we can sort of get a feel for how he played, how his brilliance developed, and so I can sort of take on some of the myths that have developed around Mikhail Tal. But this next game in the loop we're looking at, this is him playing Dmitry Rovner. This would be one of the Soviet Championship qualifiers in 1955. This would be the semifinals in Riga. Of course, Mikhail Tal was Latvian, which at that point was part of the Soviet Union. Tal was black here. E4. E6. This might seem surprising, because nowadays we sort of view the French as a quiet positional opening. Back then, nothing could be further from the truth. There's a reason why a player like Victor Korchnoi played the French all his life. It can be a very belligerent opening if the player with the black pieces wants to take the imbalances and make something out of them. Now we sort of associate the French with trying to draw as quickly as possible, but back then nothing could be further from the truth. It was a very aggressive opening. D4. Knight D2, this is the Tarrasch. Nowadays, this is a little bit hard for white to get anything out of. Back then, it was, along with Knight C3, probably the main line. Just a quick highlight I have to mention. E5, this is my old, I have to mention my old childhood favorite here. Just a background on myself, I used to play E4 completely until mid-20s. I'm 37 now. At some point, I redid my repertoire because I wanted to try something new and get different results for myself. But I played exclusively 1e4 as white. This was my way of facing the French. In my way, it's sort of, in some ways, the critical test of the French. I don't think it's the best way to face the French anymore. Bishop d7 is what really changed my mind about the advance. I think if queen b6 is played after a3, I think white does legitimately have good chances for an advantage, because the queen on b6 just doesn't make a lot of sense if you're able to defuse the pressure on d4. But bishop d7 is more flexible. It's not immediately spending time bringing the queen out. It's just continuing development and waiting for white to commit to something. So I have to mention my old childhood favorite, but knight d2, of course, this is one of the main lines against the French. Knight f6, this is a little bit less popular nowadays. It's seen that c5 is the way to equalize, and it's pretty effortless equalization. This line is the main reason that the Tarrasch has gone out of favor, because it's very difficult for white to get anything out of these positions, if anything at all. In your own games, you can get in a balance and play for a win, but at the Grandmaster level, where an opening advantage actually matters a lot, white just doesn't get a whole lot from these positions anymore. So knight f6 keeps more imbalance in the position, but it also gives white a bit more of what he's looking for. It gives him more of a typical squeeze. Knight f7, for some reason, knight e4 actually has some theory attached to it. I think there was even an Informator article at some point, but it's just bad. Just check the notes. It loses a pawn, more or less. Knight f7 standard. c5, so this is the traditional French pawn break. As I reiterate in lesson after lesson with my own students and in these sessions, look to your pawn breaks. Pawn breaks are the engines of your play. That's where you bring one of your pawns into capturing contact with another pawn, with the idea that you're opening up lines or changing the position dynamically. In the French, there's two main pawn breaks to look out for. So there's c5, and then there's f6. And black is deploying these pawn breaks against this typical white center against the French as a way of breaking down that pawn center to prevent them from getting choked to death. Always look to your pawn breaks. So here black is getting that typical French pawn break in. Knight c6. Knight e2. This is the main line. It's not mandatory. I've never played the Tarrasch, so I was a little bit surprised, but knight gf3 is actually pretty good, and it's actually similar to an opening I played a lot when I was a kid. cx. So, looks like the pawn on d4 is hanging, but white just makes a gambit out of it. And this is very similar to the Milner-Berry gambit, which is something you get out of the advance, except in the Milner-Berry, the knight's on e7, not d7. And that's actually a big detail in white's favor. Because on e7, it can still hop to c6, can hop to g6, pressure this pawn on e5. It's got good routes to go to. Here in d7, it's not really terribly well placed, especially after white gets b4 in. Yeah, this position has actually happened quite a bit, and white actually scores quite well from here. And the engine actually likes this, and it's pretty hard to convince an engine of a pawn sacrifice being good, so it must be pretty good. But that said, knight e2 is the main line. Queen b6. With modern eyes, I mean, queen b6 is so popular, but doing without queen b6 just scores much better, and the engine likes a lot more. And this is very similar to what we get in the game, except the queen is not on b6. And we see over and over that the queen on b6 doesn't really accomplish anything for black. The main goal is to get those pawn breaks in. Once black gets those pawn breaks in, that's really what he's looking for. The queen on b6 isn't the thing he's trying to accomplish. So queen b6, it's common, and actually scores relatively decently, a little bit worse. But the engine absolutely hates it, and the tactics just never work with this queen being on b6. So knight f3, that's the point of the reorganization. The knights go to e2 and f3 to protect that strong point of d4. Castle. So very standard position for the French. White scores pretty well from here, and the engine absolutely loves white's play. More or less, white has this isolated pawn on d4. As long as white's able to keep that pawn in good standing, white should be positionally better. Because black's got this backward pawn on e6, he's got this weak bishop on c8 because of it. So really the struggle of this position is going to be black trying to dynamically break down white's defenses of d4. If white's able to hold those defenses and start to push the defensive trenches forward, he's better. If black's able to break white's grip on d4 somehow, black at least equalizes. And that comes into some tactical themes later. Bishop d6, knight c3. This, in my opinion, is a pure waste of time. Bishop f4, it's positionally logical. It's immediately challenging this good bishop on d6. Now, tactically, we have to make sure it works out, because it obviously hanging the b2 pawn. But from everything I can find, this tactically works out. So knight takes, castle. Of course, knight can't take on d4. It just drops the queen. Queen xb2 is critical, but this looks like it's all working for white. So rook e1, point at the weak pawn first. And then g3, and this nice little quiet move, from what I can see so far, actually really nicely underlines black's helplessness. It sort of keeps everything in stasis and waits for black to commit to something. Let's say queen a3, h4, just continuing to play a pawn down, and this was very surprising to me. But white can always get the pawn back. You know, the extra pawn is on e6 here. That can fall off basically whenever white wants it to. But white can just continue to probe these weaknesses on the king side. h7 is weak, e6 is weak. These knights can start hopping over to probe the weak king side, because this queen's stranded over here on a3, because the queen side's still completely asleep. White can play like this. Yeah, I think white has more than enough for the pawn here. This is a very critical position for her. So castle dodges it. Doesn't take on b2. But this is just a routine edge for white, in my opinion. Yeah, this is definitely at least slightly better for white. Just bad bishop, pressure against the king side. Black doesn't really have any play just yet. The pawn on d4 is doing just fine. So knight c3. It spends more time moving this piece, and it's moving that piece away from the king side. You know, the king side is where white wants to be playing, so moving this knight to c3 is moving it away from where white wants to be playing. Castle. Knight b5. This is definitely a waste of time. Bishop g5. So just continue mobilizing. I've said very often, when you look at the players of the greats, one thing you always notice is they just continue to develop. It's rare to see a great player stuck in a situation where they have half their pieces asleep, undeveloped. Always be developing your pieces. h6, now taking a b2 is an outright error, and it's a decisive one. Rook e3, and the black queen is completely trapped. Bishop x h7 check is coming next. So h6. Bishop h4, so now the goal is to just drop back to g3 and neutralize the strong bishop at d6, which enhances white's control of this hole in e5. Bishop e3, knight takes. This is actually a favorable transformation for white. These double pawns actually make his position stronger, and the pawn's more active on g3 than is on h2. To some, it might sound weird to talk about pawn activity, but pawns are pieces just like any other, and the more active your pawns can be, the better your position is. So here, this pawn on g3 actually enhances the stability of white's king side, controls this key f4 square. f6, queen x b2 still isn't working. a3 seals the queen in, and the black queen is trapped suddenly. So rook f6, and white can be very happy with this position. The threat to b2 is still ephemeral, so white hasn't had to waste any time dealing with it. This is a very nice position for white, especially his dark square bishop didn't really have much of a role, so he's happy to get that off the board. So knight b5 is just a complete waste of time. Just the bishop's happy on b8. Bishop d6, this is definitely an experience from Tal. I think even a couple years from now, 1957, a couple years from this time, he placed 5th through 7th in the U.S. Soviet Championship final. So I think certainly by then he would have seen knight g4 pretty effortlessly. This bishop is perfectly fine on b8. It's very happy playing towards king side. Bishop c2, queen d8, a little bit too early for this, even though it's incredibly thematic. To let a cat out of the bag, rook xf3, that exchange sacrifice, it's very crucial in this pawn structure. It's going to be crucial in this game, but here it's too early. White consolidates. But just queen d8, just bring the queen over to help pressure. Queen c7, sort of a two-step to pressure h2. h6. And this is a tense struggle. I think both sides can be fairly happy with what they have here. White's got a good grip in the center, but black has good kingside attacking prospects here. But bishop d6 is just giving white, and white takes it here. So white goes back to that previous variation we looked at for white that's favorable. This is even worse. I mean, he should play h6 like we previously looked at. Rook e2. This is a huge mistake. Just that one little slip. And here it's because he's tending to this b2 pawn, but tactically he doesn't need to. The b2 pawn basically holds itself in these variations. Knight e5 is crucial, just occupying the hole. Now we're threatening bishop x f6 and knight x d7, so black has to act. Queen x b2, this isn't working. Bishop c8, it's solid, but it's completely passive. White can just play rook e3, lift the rook over to the king side. I do some variations after this to analyze the position, but basically the essence is white's very solid and happy with his activity. Queen x b2 is critical, it's not working. Knight b5, this is a common response against this queen x b2 tactically, just sort of sealing the way out for the queen. Bishop x e5 is my main line. And white, this is very complicated. I don't want to make the video too long with these variations. So you can take a look at these in the game notes that I have in the comments below, as always. But the main line here, white has a way to advantage pretty easily. And black has compensation for the exchange for sure. So black has compensation for the exchange. Black has a pawn. This passed d pawn is fairly strong. This knight's fairly active. But this is definitely an advantage for white. You know, the exchange means something in this position. These rooks are going to get active. It's not the sort of position where those rooks are going to be passive forever. There are some other variations, like I said, don't want to make things too long going over those. But more or less the essence of the position is white is spending time in a sharp position guarding this pawn in b2 when he really doesn't have to. And that one slip, that little expenditure of time, allows white to take the initiative. Plus the rook in e2 is actually very poorly placed. It blocks out the queen's guardianship of f3, which becomes relevant immediately. So this knight hops to g4. This looks like just a harassing move, but this is an incredibly common tactical theme in these sorts of positions. We open up the f-file. In similar to an exchange sacrifice in the Sicilian defense, rook xf3 is absolutely thematic in these positions. If you play the French, and you get in this sort of structure, rook x f3 is just one of those moves you need to be analyzing constantly. H3. Dima Rovner is spending a move to force Mikhail Tal to sacrifice. It's probably not a good idea. You don't need to tell Tal twice. Level iteration. Yeah, this is weakening the king's side and just forcing Tal to make a good move. Bishop e5 is more or less forced. He needs to eliminate some of black's dynamism. This knight on c6 is helping pressure d4. It needs to come off the board. Rook f5 is the best move. Rook e8. This is a pawn sacrifice, but again, we're going kingside. I have no doubt Tal would have played this move and just gone straight for the kingside attack. Rook x d6, this is forced. If rook e1, just thematic move. If you play the French, this move isn't your heart and soul. Queen h6, and this is an absolutely decisive attack. So rook x d6 gets some material off the board. White is solid, but he doesn't have enough for the exchange. It's actually fairly close. White's going to have a pretty good grip on the dark squares. That'll help enhance his defensive stability. So he can plug something on e5 after chasing this knight away. That'll help him defend, but it's not enough for the exchange. But h3 is just collapsing, and absolutely thematic. Rook x f3. You can tell the younger Tal was still struggling with some of the finer details of play, like the positional niceties, and this is something he continued to struggle with, even up to beating Botvinnik. But the actual dynamic details of playing dynamic, aggressive chess, he just instinctively had in his heart and soul. He just mashes out the correct sacrifice perfectly. Knight h2, again, he's struggling with the niceties. I think older Tal would have played knight x d4 pretty easily. This is definitely more than enough for the exchange. The king side is weakened. Black has these very strong two bishops, so this bishop's going to come to c6, and then e5, e4, just start to bulldoze through the center. So bishop x h7 is best. And we're actually back to even material, but this is a humongous advantage for black here. So we've got the bishop pair, we've got this passed d pawn, which is definitely an asset, we've got this weakened white king side. Absolutely fantastic. So knight h2 is not the most accurate. I think an older Tal would have played knight x d4 pretty easily, but this is still good enough to win. King g2, king g2, this is collapsing. Rook e3 is absolutely necessary. There's some long variations with the main line that I give. Queen h5, it's the aggressive move. Rook g1, completely accurate. And we find our way through the thickets to a perpetual. So actually, knight h2 gave up a perpetual through the thicket. It'd be very difficult for white to find this. But king g2, it's hard to make general statements about concrete, sharp lines like these, but more or less, the generality you can take away is get your pieces over to defend. King g2 is just moving the king up. It doesn't accomplish anything. White needs to defend that weak point in f3. So rook e3 actually gets an extra piece into the defense. Actually, two extra pieces. Knight x d4 completely, and then kicks the bishop away. Bishop h4, this is the final mistake. F4, black is still much better. Again, this is similar to the other line we looked at, where black's actually technically down a pawn here, but this is a technically winning position for black, probably. Two bishops, big passed d pawn, shattered king side on the white side. This is fantastic. But, bishop f4, a little bit of a mistake. Again, I think older Tal would have immediately seen the logic of just mobilize that one last piece. The f file is the key file, so just spend that extra move to get the rook into the game. Bishop f4, a little bit inaccurate. Bishop g6, also inaccurate. Bishop g3 is better. Queen xb2, this is still better for white, or for black. Bishop g6 just finally collapses. queen xb2. So in the final position, black is actually down in exchange, but it hardly matters because these pieces are just absolutely swarming over white's position. And notice to the end, this rook on a1 just never did anything in the game. What Tal was able to accomplish, and he did this with some mistakes, really the essence of the position. We'll go back. The essence of this position, through the slight missteps, black was able to consistently mobilize. So you see the general shift of black's position was toward the king side. And that's, with this open f file and that activity, that's exactly the way black wanted to play. White never achieved any play on any other part of the board. He never established his outpost in e5 to block out these pieces. He never achieved any positive play on the queen side with like an a3, b4. White's play was never actually happening, and even through the slight missteps that Tal was making through youth and inexperience, his general drift was always towards the king side. He always kept bringing pieces into the game. That's exactly what you want to do in your own attacking games. You want to consistently mobilize. And here, the last big mistake he made, if he just mobilized that one last piece to that weak point on f3, that would have been immediately decisive. This is completely winning for black. He's got 2 pawns for the exchange. Plus this pawn is just going to march to e4. So even through the technical missteps that Tal made in the execution, his overall plan was excellent, and he already showed that fantastic instinct for the initiative that I had, and that instinct for when a sacrifice was absolutely correct, because that rook xf3 concept, it's part and parcel of playing this sort of French structure completely correctly. So also this myth that Tal was sort of born a calculating machine was always positively flawless. Also incorrect. He was just showing the sort of normal inexperience that a young player has, even if he's incredibly talented. You can also see this in players like Ali Reza. Aggressive, creative, but still making mistakes here and there. But as they continue to learn and grow, they start to become a lot more precise. And you see this, we'll see this with Tal's games as we continue to go along. His concepts get larger and more precise overall. But classic attacking game from Tal. We're going to continue with our look at Tal's games. My name's John. I'll see you later.